Andrew, I'm going to play you a clip of yourself on this very podcast from December the 13th.
It seems to me that the best thing for a Labour government to do in these circumstances is, A, to find itself more fiscal firepower. I don't care how it does it. I don't care if the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, gets up and says, we can't keep our promises on income tax. I am therefore going to resign and hand over to somebody else, and then she comes back. There are all sorts of ways. They need more fiscal firepower.
You've been talking loosely about this possibility of Rachel Reeves going for a while. In fact, I'm calling it. It's your scoop, which obviously would allow Labour to break the fiscal rules and raise taxes. We talked about it again last week. And then suddenly, after that, again, obviously because anybody has listened to the New Statesman podcast, the idea took on a life of its own in all the weekend newspapers. And at yesterday's PMQ, Starmer had to insist that Reeves would be Chancellor for many years to come. I mean, what changed?
Well, first of all, I think I sounded very resonant there. Good for Andrew Marr. However, there is a little flaw in Andrew Marr's analysis there, which Andrew Marr has to point out, which is that, of course, if they did that, if Rachel Reeves stepped to one side and they said we're going to break our promises and raise income tax, for instance, then Keir Starmer would have to go as well, as I've written this week. Keir Starmer or Number 10 do insist that it was Rachel Reeves herself who insisted on those tax promises in the election, no rising of VAT or income tax or national insurance for employees, all of that. But actually, in real terms, these were Starmer's promises as well. So I think there is no chance of them raising income tax in the short term. I would like to see a wealth tax. I've always said that. And it's true that if Rachel Reeves was removed or did remove herself from the Treasury, they could look again at the fiscal rules. But the real question, and the question I've been trying to address this week, is what then? What is the alternative economic strategy that's better than Rachel Reeves's one at the moment? You know, we are very, very heavily taxed as a country at the moment. We've seen the impact on business of the rise in national insurance contributions for employers, and that's been pretty tough and grim. The economy seems to me, Will knows much more about this than I do, but the economy seems to me still in a very, very parlous state. So I think coming in with swinging new tax rises now would be very dangerous indeed. And similarly, yes, without Rachel Reeves there, the Treasury could change its fiscal rules, could move them further forward, as our colleague Freddie Hayward has been arguing for a long time. But given the mood in the bond markets at the moment, what's the result of that going to be? You know, we are already paying a lot of money for our borrowing. So I don't see a radical alternative policy right now in this very delicate and fragile state of the economy. And I think, therefore, that this week's announcements on investing in AI and trying to get the big AI and tech companies into Britain more is a perfectly sensible thing to be doing.
Well, the perfect time to turn to Will Dunn, because what would be the impact? Say, one argued it were politically wise to get rid of Rachel Reeves, which arguably it isn't. But would it make any difference? Would it calm the markets?
I mean, I'll start by saying, certainly, if your boss has to get up in front of the nation and say, look, I'm definitely not going to sack this person, then it probably is time to brush up the CV. I think, in general, there are two sides to it, aren't there? There's whether it would make a difference economically and whether it would make a difference politically. Economically, there has been a lot of talk, a lot of headlines about the bond market in the past week or so. And the reason for that is that, so if we look back to 2022, just after the mini budget, the famous mini budget,
which didn't crash the economy, because that would be defamatory to say that.
Well, I'll get to that actually. But the yield, okay, so the cost of borrowing for the government on a 10-year gilt, so a 10-year UK government bond, hit 4.5%, and that was terrible. And the Chancellor had to go, and then the Prime Minister had to go. Nightmare. Let's hope that never happens again.
Kwarteng and Liz Truss.
Yeah, this week it hit 4.89%, so it's well above where it was after the mini budget. Nightmare. Chancellor has to go. Prime Minister has to go. No, actually, because it's not the same. Okay, so the pound has not plummeted in the same way. Okay, so there was a historic plunge in the value of the pound against other currencies after the mini budget. But perhaps more importantly, after the mini budget, there was this massive divergence between where the markets were pricing UK government debt and the government debt of other countries. If you look at a graph of UK and US treasuries Today, they are almost identical. Like they pretty much perfectly correlate. The debt of other countries, like say Germany, is also rising. So there isn't the same divergence in the spread between those bonds.
So we're not an outlier today.
No, and we were at that time, and that's why there is now this kind of consensus that the markets look at what the government is doing and approve or disapprove of it, and a bunch of what are sometimes called bond vigilantes somewhere in a dark room say, right, let's get rid of the Prime Minister. That doesn't happen, okay? Because, and like that narrative is really being propagated across the news. So I've got a quote from BBC News here, which says, the soaring cost of government borrowing is a symptom of the markets collectively sounding unconvinced by the government's economic strategy. Okay, that's not true. Okay, that's not what happens.
So what happens?
Buying a bond is a bet on where interest rates are going to head and where the prices of other countries' bonds are going to head. Okay, so it's not to do with the market's opinion of fiscal policy. It can be influenced by that, and clearly, the mini budget had an impact. But what's happening now is that lots of different global conditions are coming together to affect the price of government debt around the world, and that is making economic conditions for our government and for other governments very difficult, particularly for our government because our fiscal headroom is so low. So it's unfortunate, but it's not really Rachel Reeves' fault. Unfortunately, that also means you have to admit that it wasn't really Liz Truss's fault either.
Ooh.
Wow. Wow. Now,
controversial.
Given how much Will understands about all of this stuff, I hesitate to question, still less to push back, still less to heckle. But it does seem to me that one of the things going on in the markets is that they are, in a sense, also pricing the credibility and reputation of the UK government. And this is all happening at a time when Musk, with his 200 million plus followers, and others are really going for Starmer, really going for Reeves as incompetent socialist dinosaurs who don't understand what they're doing. And I do suspect that they are picking the market makers are picking up the general atmosphere about this government. And that is a bit of the story. In other words, that you can't completely separate the general reputation of the government as it's being pushed around the world by American big tech from what's going on in the markets. But perhaps I'm wrong about that.
I think, there are lots of people who are all much more intelligent than me who have a hard time saying exactly why the markets are moving in particular directions. And there are lots and lots of money spent trying to figure out those questions. And it's almost impossible to say. But one of the things that is significant, which doesn't get talked about in headlines very much, is that so there are two main actors in the price of debt. Okay, so there is the bond market, but there's also the central bank. Okay, so the central bank sets the price of debt through the interest rates.
The Bank of England in our case.
Yeah, and the bond market sets the price of debt through gilt yields, through how much they are prepared to pay to buy bonds, to buy debt. So I'm going to try and explain why it's maybe the Bank of England's fault, which Liz Truss, I'm sure, would love. It's not entirely the Bank of England's fault exactly, but all right, Hannah, have you ever been to an auction and bought an extremely expensive painting?
No, I haven't, no.
But something you might have noticed about the auctions for paintings is that they go for an enormous amount of money, right? Dizzying amounts of money for a bit of paint on some canvas or a bit of wood. Why is that? Partly, I'm sure the buyers would say it's the price of owning a piece of genius. But it's also the fact that these paintings are sold within a very well-handled, very well-managed market, okay? And one of the means that auction houses have used in the past to manage that market is a thing called gallery bids, right? So that is where, I think it might be called that because somebody up in the gallery, some, unknown hand goes up. When a painting isn't selling for quite enough, somebody will raise their hand and, put in a good bid, and that might stimulate. Bid. Yeah. And actually, it's the auction house. It's somebody from the auction house has been sent to stand in the crowd and go, actually, this is what, and then people say, okay, so it's worth that much.
Well, if they want it, maybe I'm missing out.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, I want you to imagine that at some point there is a crisis in confidence in the art market and people think, oh, the paintings are fake, or, they're all going to shred themselves like that weird Banksy thing as soon as you buy them. And the whole market seizes up. One way to get it started again would be to get a whole load of gallery bids going, and people would say, oh, no, there is confidence, there is, and bid up the price of the paintings. That is what has happened with government debt in the past 15 years. Central banks have acted like those galleries, and they have put in trillions and trillions and trillions of pounds worth of literally tens of trillions of pounds worth of gallery bids for government debt over the course of 15 years. That took place over a long period of time, and most people have forgotten how much government debt used to cost. And I think the world is now kind of returning to that, because what central banks are doing now is they're doing the opposite. They are returning the paintings to the auctions. Okay, they're trying to sell off all the paintings they bought during that time, which, for any listener still conscious, is quantitative tightening, and that is happening at the same time around the world, and that is pushing up the price of government debt, and that is part of the picture that led to the defenestration of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. It's part of the picture of why government debt is so expensive and so jittery now. Now, I'm not saying it has nothing to do with fiscal policy, but that's the big kind of background picture as to why the bond markets are more dangerous for politicians now.
Right, Andrew,
I think for a brief microsecond there, I had a flash of almost understanding something important. So well done, Will. That was brilliant.
But what about, sorry, just to take it back to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the whole narrative around at that time was that they hadn't told anybody that they were going to do this. Everybody was spooked. No one was prepared. Whereas pre the first Labour budget, where obviously we had these huge tax rises, but they did oodles of briefing. And while people weren't happy about everything, they knew what to expect. Surely...
Yeah. I'm definitely not saying that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng weren't spectacularly incompetent in the way that they launched their mini-budget. Liz Truss never spoke to Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, before doing this, and he was preparing the day before the mini-budget to sell back £60 billion worth of government bonds to the market. They were making that announcement. And that was just, they might have got away with it if they hadn't been so incompetent and so combative towards the institutions around them.
I think we come back to that very, very fundamental thing that you cannot separate what happens in the markets from the reputation of a government and the credibility of government. If they don't talk to the experts, if they don't tell anyone what they're doing, and then they surprise or spook the markets, that's one thing. But also at the moment, you have a government which, frankly, the markets around the world, a lot of the big players online are anti-social democratic, anti-socialist, were already biased against people like Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. And the last few weeks have turbocharged that to a point where the crashing reputation of Keir Starmer and the falling reputation in some quarters of the UK are not distinguishable.
Where's the room for hope, Andrew? Because you've written in your piece for the New Statesman this week, not only would it be mad, as we've discussed, to get rid of Rachel Reeves, and it would also mean Keir Starmer having to go. But you've said that Labour, they can't afford to panic on the economy. So what should they be doing?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there is no alternative but to pull every possible lever to get growth starting again and to reassure business that this is a growth economy. I mean, there were hoots of laughter, not surprisingly, in the Commons yesterday when Rachel Reeves was talking about being a government of growth. But, there is a lot to do quite quickly on liberalising the planning system. There is a lot to do to allow, for instance, the data hubs that these big AI announcements involve to happen. There is a lot more to do they can do on liberalisation. I think there are a lot of conversations to be had with business about keeping the current tax regime going for the next 4 years, guaranteeing that. And, as I've said before, we are in a position where we are a relatively small, still quite big, but a relatively small player in this very, very turbulent, fast-moving global economy. If Trump comes in and actually starts to make the tax cuts that he's been talking about at the scale he's been talking about and starts to spend in a way that he's been talking about, then that is going to change everything. And I think it's irrational at this point to devise a new British economic strategy at a time when we know so little. We know that we are not in a worse position than the French and the Germans in particular, who are. So in some respects, we are an attractive place still to invest in. That's where the hope comes from, I think. But it's a time to hunker down, hold your nerve, and do what can be done that's not going to make anything worse.
Well, how are we to read these two figures we've had in the last 24 hours? Maybe a surprise fall in inflation in December yesterday, 2.5%, whopping 0.1% growth we've heard about this morning. Does that give the government any more wiggle room?
So the basically flat GDP figure is not great news for a government. It's not a great headline for a government that came in promising the highest growth in the G7. The slightly lower than expected inflation number does have some benefit for the government, or it's better news for Rachel Reeves, because the lower inflation is, the faster the central bank is likely to cut interest rates. The other problem that with higher interest rates and with higher bond yields is they reflect things like the housing market. So that one of the ways in which mortgages are priced is with reference to gilt yields. So if you want to get lots of people building houses, then you need to have a good, well-performing housing market for those house builders to think they're going to make money. It's kind of mixed news.
It wasn't just that Keir Starmer said he had absolute confidence in Rachel Reeves and she would certainly be in post for the rest of this Parliament, because we have seen so many occasions when Prime Ministers express absolute confidence in somebody days before they fire them. It's much more, I think, that he ruled out any kind of emergency budget, and that those two pieces of news are a little bit better for Rachel Reeves in the short term.
Well, that actually brings in two questions that we've had from listeners on this. So before you make your next point, they've come in through newstatesman.com/you ask us. And one was, how likely is it the Chancellor remains in post in the next 12 months?
Likely.
Very likely.
Very likely.
And can Rachel Reeves seriously stick to the fiscal rules? And you're saying she's going to have to.
Politically, I think the thing that we should be focusing on is what happens in March and April after the OBR has given its report, the Office of Budget Responsibility, and what happens to the spending plans going forward, particularly of the non-protected departments, because I think an awful lot of MPs are bracing themselves for some really grim news. When it comes to welfare spending, we have a huge problem of poverty in this country. When it comes to defence, we really need to spend a lot more in defence quite quickly, and so on and so on. And I think that's really when the rubber hits the road. And there is I wouldn't say it's a panicky mood, but a mood of extreme foreboding. Labour MPs saying to me, I'm not quite sure why I'm a Labour MP. If this is the kind of policy, if it's yet more austerity and no easy end to it, what am I doing here? What is this for? What do I say to my constituents? Now, I think that is the moment of maximum danger, not just for Rachel Reeves, but also for Keir Starmer.